the North Atlantic, winter of 1942. The sea was a graveyard, black and endless, its surface broken only by the dim shapes of merchant convoys crawling toward Britain. Every wave seemed to hide an unseen predator. Beneath those waves, German U-boats waited, silent, patient, hungry. In those early months of America's entry into the war, the ocean itself had become the front line. The Allies were losing ships faster than they could replace them, and each sinking tightened a noose around Britain's fragile supply chain. In Washington and London, reports arrived daily. Tanker torpedoed off Newfoundland, freighter lost near Iceland, ammunition ship gone without a trace. Each loss meant men, material, and morale slipping beneath the cold Atlantic. Factories at home were running day and night, but the yards that built the merchant vessels still followed methods from another age: wooden scaffolds, hand-driven rivets, slow progress measured in months, not days. When the first Liberty ship designs appeared on the drafting tables, naval engineers whispered the same phrase, "It can't be done." They weren't wrong to doubt. A single cargo ship demanded tens of thousands of parts, miles of welds, mountains of steel. Building one took most of a year, and yet the Allies needed them by the hundreds. Without them, Britain would starve, Russia would freeze, and America's armies would never cross an ocean. The statistics were brutal. In 1942 alone, German submarines sank more than 1,000 Allied ships. Every morning new names were added to the list. Gray silhouettes turned to red X's on the wall maps. Roosevelt called it the Battle of the Atlantic, but to those who lived it, it was less a battle than a slow bleed. Crews sailed knowing that survival depended on luck, not armor. At the Bethlehem and Kaiser yards, workers stared at unfinished hulls stretching down dry docks like skeletal giants. Sparks flew from torches, but production crawled. The old way demanded precision by hand, every rivet hole drilled, every plate fitted one after another. And yet, across the sea, Hitler's shipyards were turning out submarines with terrifying efficiency. Something had to change, or the Allies would lose not to bullets, but to arithmetic. America had entered an industrial war. Victory would go, not to the bravest soldiers, but to whoever could outbuild the other side. For the first time in modern history, the battlefield reached into the factory floor. Men and women who would never hear a shot fired were suddenly soldiers of steel and steam. Their weapons were cranes, torches, and blueprints. Their enemy was time. In that desperate atmosphere, government committees met around the clock. Naval officers demanded faster results. Shipyard foremen argued they were already at their limit. The words, "impossible schedule," echoed in every meeting room. To shorten a 230-day construction cycle to even half seemed madness. Yet in a corner of the West Coast, one civilian, neither admiral nor engineer, was quietly imagining the unthinkable, a ship that could be born not in months, but in days. He was dismissed at first as a dreamer, maybe even a fool. The war was full of such men, enthusiasts with schemes for miracle weapons or revolutionary machines that never worked. But this man's revolution would not depend on science fiction. It would depend on something older and simpler, changing how people worked together. The world did not yet know it, but the age of slow-craft shipbuilding was about to die. The wind howled through the skeletal frameworks of unfinished ships as welders worked beneath tarpaulin shelters. The shipyards at Richmond, Portland, and Baltimore were seas of steel and sound, hammer blows, the hiss of acetylene, the deep clang of plates meeting hulls. America was trying to learn how to build faster, but speed demanded sacrifice, and every shortcut risked catastrophe at sea. To the old hands, shipbuilding was an art. Generations of craftsmen had learned to shape and fit steel with the patience of sculptors. The idea that a ship could be assembled like a toy from prefabricated parts offended their pride. They scoffed at proposals to mass-produce vessels as if they were cars rolling off an assembly line. Ships were born of sweat and precision, they argued, not conveyor belts and factory rhythms, but beyond that pride lay fear. Fear of failure, fear that innovation might cost lives. A single flaw in a weld could doom a ship and its crew. The stakes were too high for experiments, yet America's back was against the wall. The U-boat packs were winning. Entire convoys vanished overnight, and the Allies could not move supplies fast enough to keep up with the losses. Every hour wasted on caution brought the Atlantic closer to collapse. It was in this crucible that Henry Kaiser began to challenge everything the shipbuilding world believed. He was not a naval architect, not even a trained engineer. He had built roads, dams, and factories, projects measured in cubic yards of concrete, not tons of steel. But what he understood better than anyone was organization. He knew how to manage time, people, and motion itself. Where others saw impossibility, he saw inefficiency. Kaiser had already shocked the country once before. When he helped build the Hoover Dam, experts predicted it would take 10 years. He finished it in 5. He was the kind of man who looked at a mountain and wondered how to make it move faster. So when the Maritime Commission begged for help increasing ship production, Kaiser answered with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He would not just speed up the process, he would reinvent it. At first, Washington didn't take him seriously. His proposals sounded reckless. He spoke of modular construction, breaking ships into sections built separately and welded together. Traditional shipbuilders dismissed it as fantasy, but Kaiser had something they didn't: a belief in teamwork over tradition. He gathered foremen, engineers, and draftsmen from across the nation, telling them, "We're not here to build ships the old way. We're here to build them the new way, and fast." His yards didn't look like shipyards. They looked like massive factories, grids of cranes, floodlights, and welding arcs that lit the night like lightning storms. Instead of craftsmen working on one ship for months, thousands of workers built components simultaneously: hull sections, decks, and engine housings, all prepared in parallel. When the pieces were ready, they were brought together like parts of a puzzle. A hull that once took months to shape could now take days to assemble. To the old-timers, it was chaos. To Kaiser, it was harmony in motion. He walked the docks in his hard hat, talking to workers, tweaking schedules, studying bottlenecks. His genius wasn't in any single invention, it was in managing people as if they were parts of one great machine. He applied lessons from the automotive industry, borrowed ideas from the dam projects, and demanded precision at every level. His motto spread across the yards: "Don't fight the problem, solve it." Every improvement shaved off hours. Every small innovation, a new welding sequence, a better hoist, a reorganized tool station, multiplied across thousands of workers, saving days, even weeks. And where others built one ship at a time, Kaiser built many. His yards operated like living organisms, shifts overlapping, materials flowing like blood through arteries of rails and cranes. The lights never went out. The sea breeze mixed with the smell of hot steel and oil, and the roar of progress drowned out the fear of failure. But even with all this momentum, the clock still mocked them. The official record showed it took more than 200 days to finish a Liberty ship. Kaiser wanted to bring that down to 100, then 50. People laughed. Some whispered that he was endangering the war effort with wild promises. Yet behind his calm expression, Kaiser was already sketching plans to prove them wrong. He would push his people beyond what they thought possible, not through force, but through faith. Faith that they were part of something greater than themselves. Every riveter, every welder, every crane operator was a soldier in a different kind of war, and Kaiser's battlefield was time itself. The transformation began quietly. New methods replaced old rituals. Wooden scaffolds gave way to steel gantries that could shift entire ship sections in minutes. Electric welding replaced slow, noisy riveting. Instead of hammering thousands of rivets by hand, arcs of light stitched steel plates together like a glowing thread. Women joined the workforce by the tens of thousands, their faces lit by sparks. As they learned to weld with a precision that stunned their supervisors, the newspapers called them Rosie the Riveter. But in Kaiser's yards they were simply workers, vital, capable, and indispensable. By spring of 1942, something extraordinary was happening. The ships began rolling out faster. Where once a single hull lingered on the blocks for months, now one launched every few weeks. The first Liberty ships slid into the water like a tide of steel, their gray forms carrying not just cargo, but proof. proof that America's industrial might could outpace destruction. Still, Kaiser was not satisfied. He knew the war would demand not hundreds, but thousands of ships, and he had promised to deliver them. His dream was not to build ships faster. It was to make building ships routine, a process so efficient that a ship could appear as predictably as sunrise. He was getting closer, but there were still limits. Materials ran short, equipment failed, workers burned out, and somewhere deep in the chaos of that endless production line, a new idea began to form, one that would take everything they had learned and push it beyond the edge of reason. The impossible was about to become reality. By the summer of 1942, the American shipyards had become the beating heart of a new kind of warfare, not fought with guns and tanks, but with blueprints, cranes, and the rhythm of hammers. The factories of Henry Kaiser were no longer experiments. They were miracles of motion. What once seemed reckless was now the foundation of the Allied supply chain. Yet behind the noise there was still tension, the invisible weight of time pressing against every deadline. Each morning began the same way, floodlights fading as the sun broke over the rows of gray hulls, steel glinting with dew. Thousands of workers poured through the gates, lunch pails swinging, faces drawn but determined. They came from every background imaginable: farmers from Kansas, miners from Colorado, waitresses from Oakland, all transformed into builders of ships. The roar of the yards started before dawn and didn't end until long after midnight. The factories never slept. Every hour was precious. Each spark, each weld, each crane movement was part of a grand choreography designed to cheat time itself. The shipyards were no longer bound by the old rules of construction. Instead of waiting for one phase to finish before the next began, tasks overlapped. A hull section could be built in one shed while another was fitted with engines across the yard. When both were ready, they met like puzzle pieces under the shadow of cranes large enough to lift locomotives. Kaiser's genius was not in invention, but in coordination. He turned chaos into precision. The old shipwrights who had once scoffed now watched in awe as ships seemed to rise overnight from the ground. His confidence was contagious. Supervisors walked the decks shouting schedules like battle orders, and the workers responded with an energy that bordered on defiance. Defiance of the clock, defiance of the enemy, defiance of the very idea of impossible. Each new launch was a small victory against the U-boats that still haunted the Atlantic. When a ship slid into the water for the first time, the crowd of workers cheered, not as spectators, but as soldiers celebrating a win. Women waved handkerchiefs, children clapped, and welders stood with arms crossed, faces streaked with soot and pride. These weren't just ships, they were lifelines. Proof that the Allies could still outproduce fear. Still, Kaiser knew the system could go faster. He studied the numbers late into the night, chain-smoking, surrounded by charts and notes. Every hour shaved off construction time meant another ship at sea, another convoy saved. Yet the yards had reached what the engineers called the limit of physical labor. There was only so much the human body could endure, only so many hours in a day. To go beyond that, Kaiser realized, required something greater than speed. It required a new way of thinking about work itself. That revelation came from watching his workers. He noticed how small inefficiencies multiplied. A welder waiting for a part, a crane idling for a signal, a missing tool sending a man walking across half the yard. Minutes lost turned into hours, hours into days. If he could eliminate those moments of waste, if every person knew exactly what to do, where to be, and when, then perhaps he could bend time a little further. So he brought in efficiency experts from the automotive industry, men who had studied the flow of parts through car factories. They analyzed every motion, every delay. They redrew schedules until construction became a kind of living equation. Each ship section had a birth time, a deadline, and a destination, like organs growing separately before being assembled into a living body. The shipyard became a machine, massive, loud, and alive. In Washington, skeptics still doubted. Reports came in describing Kaiser's assembly line navy, and the term was often spoken with sarcasm. Admirals complained that Liberty ships were ugly, boxy, slow, barely seaworthy. They called them Kaiser's coffins, but the merchant captains who received those ships had no such complaints. They saw them as salvation. Each new hull meant more supplies, more hope, more life. The results began to silence the critics. In less than a year, Kaiser's yards launched more than 100 ships. a feat no traditional shipbuilder would have believed possible. The cycle time dropped from 230 days to 80, then to 60. And then, in a burst of ambition that bordered on madness, Kaiser set a new goal. He wanted to build a ship in less than 2 weeks. The announcement sent shockwaves through the industry. Engineers shook their heads. Even his own managers begged him to reconsider. But Kaiser simply smiled. "If we can build one ship in 60 days, he told them, we can build it in 30. And if 30, then 10. No one laughed this time. Preparations began immediately. Kaiser's yards became laboratories of innovation. They streamlined material deliveries, pre-assembled components in off-site plants, and assigned overlapping shifts to ensure construction never paused. The welding crews worked in 24-hour rotations under towers of light. The air was filled with the sound of compressors and the steady pulse of heavy machinery. Reporters began to visit, skeptical but curious. They watched as pieces of hulls moved along rails, lifted by cranes, aligned perfectly, and fused together in showers of sparks. One journalist compared the process to watching a giant mechanical spider spinning steel webs over the ocean. Another wrote that Kaiser had turned time itself into a raw material. The experiment had begun. A single ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was selected as the test case. Every eye in the country would be on it. The question wasn't whether it could float. The question was whether the human mind could truly conquer the impossible. Kaiser didn't call it a gamble. He called it proof. Proof that America's greatest weapon was not a gun or a bomb. It was its ability to change. The countdown began. At the Richmond Shipyard, a white sign was hung over the main gate in bold black letters, SS Robert E. Peary, watch us make history. Beneath it, a clock was painted, each hour waiting to be marked off as the build progressed. It was more than a construction schedule. It was a declaration of intent. Every worker who walked under that sign understood they were part of something that would be talked about long after the war. The first day started before sunrise. Trains rumbled in carrying prefabricated steel sections from partner factories hundreds of miles away. Trucks lined the roads in endless convoys, loaded with everything from propeller shafts to paint barrels. Kaiser's logistics network had become a war machine of its own, coordinated to the minute, running on coffee, adrenaline, and faith. When the siren blew at 6 a.m., the yard came alive. Thousands of men and women moved in precise choreography. Welders sparked the first joints. Cranes swung overhead like the arms of some enormous, tireless creature. The air was alive with the pulse of industry, metallic, relentless, unyielding. The sea breeze carried the smell of oil, hot metal, and salt. From the catwalks above, supervisors watched the pattern unfold. One section finished, another arriving, a third already waiting. Every piece had its moment, its place, its purpose. There was no hesitation, no pause. Kaiser's planners had mapped every movement to the second, and yet the scene felt organic, like a living organism evolving in real time. The skeleton of the ship grew before their eyes, ribs and plates forming a body of steel where yesterday there had been only a patch of concrete. By noon, entire sections were already welded in place. Sparks flew across the yard like fireflies. Reporters scribbled furiously in notebooks. Photographers ran from angle to angle, capturing the impossible unfolding. The Robert E. Peary was not being built. It was materializing. Kaiser himself walked through the chaos calmly, his white hard hat gleaming in the sunlight. He spoke little, but his presence was electric. Everyone who caught sight of him seemed to work faster. His belief that this could be done had infected them all. They no longer doubted. They simply built. As night fell, the yard didn't slow. Floodlights blazed across the harbor, turning darkness into day. Shifts rotated seamlessly. Coffee urns steamed beside stacks of blueprints. The clang of hammers echoed off the water, a steady mechanical heartbeat. Somewhere in the control office, an engineer crossed off the first 24 hours on the board. One day gone, and already the ship's outline was unmistakable. Day 2 was faster. Every lesson from the first day was absorbed instantly. Cranes were repositioned, tool deliveries rescheduled. Nothing was left to chance. By now the ship's bow and stern were visible, separated only by the remaining midsection. Workers joked that they could see the ocean through its ribs, but no one truly laughed. They were too focused, too aware that the eyes of the nation were watching. The Peary's hull began to take on weight, form, and grace. Its gray plates gleamed under the lights like armor. The welders called it the Iron Whale. The assembly crews called it the Miracle. Reporters called it Kaiser's madness made real. Yet as the second night ended, the yard was ahead of schedule. On the third day, fatigue began to show. Hands blistered, eyes stung from smoke, and the rhythm faltered. But instead of slowing, Kaiser's supervisors rotated teams, brought in fresh crews, and pumped music through loudspeakers. Brass bands played on the pier while the work continued. What had started as a job now felt like a festival of endurance, a celebration of what ordinary people could do when they refused to believe in limits. By the fourth day, the Robert E. Peary was nearly complete. Her hull sealed, her deck fitted, her cranes installed. The ship that should have taken 8 months to build had risen in less than a week. Only the finishing touches remained: paint, wiring, and final checks. When the last weld cooled, someone scrawled on the steel with chalk, "Done in 4 days. Try and beat that." The morning of the launch was cold and clear. A crowd gathered along the docks, workers, families, officers, and reporters, their breath fogging in the air. Kaiser stood near the bow, coat collar turned up against the wind. Cameras clicked, a band struck up a march, and then, with a low groan and a spray of water, the SS Robert E. Peary slid down the ways and into the sea. The impossible had become reality. The crowd erupted. Cheers echoed across the harbor, mingling with the blast of the ship's whistle. Men who had worked 3 straight days without sleep wept openly. Women waved flags and threw their gloves into the air. For a moment the war felt far away. There was only triumph, the pure, staggering realization that they had done what no one in history had ever done before. Across the Atlantic, British newspapers picked up the story. "America builds ship in 4 days," the headlines read. Churchill himself was said to have smiled when he heard. For a nation that had watched its lifelines vanish beneath U-boat torpedoes, this was more than news. It was hope. Kaiser didn't celebrate for long. When reporters asked if he would try to beat the record, he shook his head. "The record doesn't matter," he said quietly. "What matters is that now we know what's possible." And with that, he turned back toward the yards. There were more ships to build, hundreds more. The Peary had proven that the laws of time could bend under human will. Now came the true challenge, to make that miracle routine. The race against the ocean had just begun. In the weeks that followed the launch of the Robert E. Peary, the shipyards became legends in themselves. The story spread faster than the ship could sail. Newspapers ran photos of tired welders standing beside their creation, faces smeared with soot and pride. Radio hosts called it a 4-day miracle. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the American public felt that they were not merely surviving, they were winning. But for Henry J. Kaiser, the celebration was brief. The Peary had been a demonstration, a flash of brilliance to prove the impossible could be done. The true goal was far greater, to make that miracle happen again and again on an industrial scale, until the ocean was filled with Liberty ships. That meant transforming a singular triumph into a repeatable science. He knew momentum was fragile. Enthusiasm could fade, efficiency could crumble, and the slightest complacency could return the yards to old habits. So Kaiser doubled down on discipline. Every lesson from the Peary's construction was dissected, logged, and standardized. Workflows were redrawn, schedules tightened, and new teams trained in the same relentless rhythm. His management style evolved into a doctrine, a blend of precision, purpose, and human respect that no rule book could teach. He believed that people built faster when they understood why their work mattered. In every meeting, in every inspection, he repeated the same message. Every plate, every weld, every bolt you drive keeps a soldier alive. The words became a mantra that echoed across the shipyards. It was no longer just about steel. It was about survival. The Richmond yards became symbols of American power. They sprawled across the waterfront like small cities, their lights visible for miles. The clang of metal, the hiss of torches, and the rumble of cranes created a rhythm that seemed to pulse with life. Ships stood in every stage of birth, some little more than skeletons, others nearly complete, their names already painted proudly on their bows. Inside the gates, time was measured not in hours, but in progress. Shift whistles divided the day into relentless cycles. As one crew left, another replaced them without pause. Cafeterias operated around the clock, serving tens of thousands of meals a day. Medical tents treated burns, cuts, exhaustion, and the occasional sprained wrist from someone moving too fast to notice their own limits. Kaiser's workforce was unlike anything the country had ever seen. Men and women worked side by side, young and old, veterans and newcomers. Entire families found employment within the same yard. Mothers welded while sons hauled steel. Fathers ran cranes while daughters painted hulls. In that shared purpose, the lines between class, gender, and background blurred. They were all builders of freedom now. The war effort had reshaped America's identity. The once sleepy West Coast had become a thunderous industrial frontier. Cafes, housing blocks, and schools sprang up almost overnight to support the swelling tide of workers. Towns that had barely existed a few years before now buzzed with life. The air was thick with the smell of salt, smoke, and optimism. Still, beneath the triumph lay tension. The relentless pace came with a cost. Fatigue grew heavy in every pair of shoulders. Mistakes became more common. A misplaced weld here, a dropped plate there. Each small flaw threatened to undo the miracle. Kaiser's supervisors implemented rigorous inspections, not to punish but to protect. Every ship was checked, every inch of steel examined before launch. The balance between speed and safety hung by a thread. Then came winter. Rain lashed the coast. Mud turned the yards into slippery quagmires. Equipment froze. Production slowed. For the first time since the Peary, Kaiser felt the weight of the impossible creeping back. The numbers slipped. Deadlines stretched. Washington sent telegrams demanding explanations. Kaiser refused to panic. Instead, he looked inward, to the spirit of his people. He began to hold open meetings, listening to workers' ideas. Many of the improvements that followed came not from engineers but from the laborers themselves. A welder suggested a new sequence that reduced warping in the hull. A crane operator proposed a system to align sections faster. These small voices combined into a chorus of innovation. By empowering his workforce, Kaiser created something far greater than efficiency. He created loyalty. The men and women of the shipyards believed in what they were doing because they saw their ideas shaping the outcome. Their fingerprints were in every seam of every ship. Production surged again. The yards found their rhythm. New record times were set, not 4 days, but 10, then 8, then sometimes 6. The miracle of the Peary was no longer a one-time event. It had become a pattern. Across the coast, the Liberty ships rose in a steady tide, each one a floating testament to what unity could achieve. Soon, Kaiser's system was adopted nationwide. Shipyards from the Great Lakes to the Gulf began following his model. Prefabrication plants sprouted like mushrooms after rain, feeding parts to coastal yards. America had built not just ships, but an entire infrastructure of speed. The numbers told the story best. In 1941, the United States launched fewer than 200 merchant ships. By the end of 1943, it launched over 1,700. Each carried supplies, troops, or fuel, the lifeblood of war. Every ship built meant another chance for victory, another nail in the coffin of fascism. Kaiser rarely spoke of glory. When journalists asked him how he felt about being called a genius, he shrugged. "I'm not a genius," he said once. "I just hate waste." That simplicity became his legacy. His refusal to accept inefficiency transformed not only the war, but the nation's understanding of what ordinary citizens could do when united by purpose. As 1943 dawned, the Liberty ships covered the Atlantic like a fleet of gray guardians. The U-boats, once hunters, became hunted. Convoys grew stronger, their losses fewer. The balance of the Battle of the Atlantic began to shift, not because of new weapons or tactics, but because one man had dared to believe that the impossible was simply the untried. And still, Kaiser wasn't finished. In his mind, there was always another record to break, another improvement to make. The shipyards had proven that America could outbuild any enemy. Now he wanted to prove that this industrial miracle could outlast the war itself. In the heart of the roaring yards, surrounded by sparks and smoke, Henry Kaiser looked out at the horizon and saw not ships, but a future.